So I do record using the Zoom. That's another thing to point out. I do record the classes. I then put them up on the Moodle page. So you can refer back to them down the track. It's there as a resource for you. Again, that will play out a little bit more towards the end of the course, but I'll get to that in a moment. So here are some slides just to get us started. Right, can those of you on Zoom see the slide saying week 1 introduction to preaching?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. That's the other thing is that, again, the slides for each class, I tend to make those available via the Moodle page too, so you're welcome to go and download them, but I'll talk about the Moodle page in a minute. So, I'm Richard. First and foremost, I'm a dad, 2 girls there. Some of you are in the know, so Emily Colgan and I are married, and these are our 2 children. So there you go, if you've had Emily as a teacher. Lots of us, because we have different surnames, don't put us together, but there you go, we've been married for quite a long time, as it turns out, almost 17 years. So and these are our 2 girls, Micah and Arwen. So there you go, you can see yeah, quite the pale children I have. Right, there you go, very blonde, very fair children. So that's a bit about me. I'm a beekeeper. Is one of my hobbies. So I do produce honey. Well, I don't produce honey, I steal honey, but I help the bees to produce it by giving them resources, and they give me back honey. I could spend a lot of time telling you about ethical beekeeping rather than exploitative beekeeping, and there is a difference. I try to be an ethical beekeeper. I do this with my father-in-law, and we have a couple of hives, believe it or not, in Remuera. So we make honey from rich people's flowers. That's what we do. Yes. Okay. So anyway, that's an aside. I'm involved in podcasting. I'm also involved with an intentional young adults community in the Anglican Church called the Ordinary Saints Community. Grace is involved in that community also. We have a podcast that we put out at the moment sporadically, mostly because I'm too busy to record podcasts at the moment. And I also produce another podcast, which is called The Bloody Bible, which is treating the Bible as if it was true crime. So there we go, that's our little niche in the market. Emily Colgan appears as that. I am the person who records and actually edits and creates the podcast. So I do all the work and get none of the glory on that particular project. Anyway, the exciting thing is we've done 1 series already, and we actually have been employed to make the 2nd one. So there's a 2nd series coming by the end of this year, apparently. Don't know when I'm going to find the time for that, but I'm going to have to. Oh yeah, I'm an Anglican priest. So my hobbies include being an ordained minister. All the other stuff is my work stuff. So I am an Anglican priest. I've been ordained for 19 years in November. So just about to move into my 20th year of ministry. The vast majority of that has been being a parish priest, and in fact this was the parish I was in for 10 years, which is also where, I'm sorry Grace, I'm going to out you, where Grace, I first met her because she came in and joined our youth group at St Andrews, so we go back a ways. Whether I was good or not at this, you can ask Grace, maybe in break time when I'm not in the room. Okay. She can be free and frank. Before that, I was in school chaplaincy, so I worked in school chaplaincy, and before that, I was actually in the Wellington Diocese and worked in city mission work, as well as in parish ministry there. Since leaving full-time parish ministry, I've been doing my PhD, and I now am something of an itinerant preacher, where I go from churches to churches, different communities week after week, preaching various places. Most recently, this last Sunday I was preaching at Auckland Cathedral, but I get around the diocese and fill in places all over the show, because I don't have a specific church that I officially belong to 100% of the time, so I fill in all over the show, which is really great, because it's a very, it's kind of easier when you're the guest preacher, I'll be honest, because you turn up, You say something and if people didn't like it, it doesn't matter because you're leaving. When you're in ministry placement for a long time and you preach something that people don't like, boy, does life get difficult in all sorts of other ways. So not that happened to me a lot, but it does happen. And I will comment on those things from time to time as we move through the course. As I just mentioned, the thing that I do full time is put people to sleep in lecture theatres. No. What this slide is about is that I'm currently in the final year of my PhD, and I'm writing in an area of psychology. Yeah, which sounds big and highfalutin, but basically there's a really simple idea that I've just spent a lot of time writing about. And that idea is, I remember when I was a student and I used to sit in a class, often like some of these people dozing off, and occasionally I would have a lecturer who would say all sorts of complicated things, and I would sit there going, I don't understand any of this. And I would look around the classroom and go, obviously I'm foolish because everyone else seems to be getting this and I'm the only person going, I don't get it. Should I ask a question? Might be embarrassing, just sit there and say nothing. And just what I since discovered is that actually what I was wrong about wasn't that I didn't understand things, it was that I thought everyone else did. And 9 times out of 10, actually they don't. They're sitting there feeling just as confused as me. The problem, and this is what's called a perceptual error, an error of judgment. My judgment was everyone else understands this and I'm the odd one out. Actually, probably most people are going, this lecture is just really bad and they're not explaining themselves very well, but none of us were brave enough to ask a question. And that situation is called pluralistic ignorance, which is what my research is all about, is finding places where that happens, particularly in the life of the church. Because there are all sorts of times where people in church don't understand things, but they don't ask questions because they think everyone else does. And in my research, I've been able to show this happens with just about everything that people in church do, from how well do you understand a communion service? People assume that that if they don't understand bits of it very well, they think everyone else does. Actually, most people don't know, well, they don't have a real depth of knowledge about it. So there's lots of that happening. Now, the exciting thing about this, and having just shared a little bit about what my day-to-day work is all about, is the thing that makes a difference to this particular effect where people sit there going, I don't know, I don't understand, but I'm the only one who does. Well, I've just told you, no, that's wrong. If you don't understand something, there's a really good chance other people don't understand too. So what that does mean is, if I say things in class that you don't get, be brave and ask, because there are probably other people who don't get it either. Okay. And that's the exciting thing about this effect, is once you learn about it, you can tell yourself and go, I think I might be there. Oh no, hang on. Richard said I'm probably not. I'll be brave and ask a question, and then the effect disappears. So once people actually know about it, it can disappear really quickly and people start asking questions, which is a great thing. So that's an encouragement just to say, do ask questions, do jump in. I will talk quite a lot. As I say, have experience preaching. Tends to be a bit of a default position for me, that I go off into little stories and so on and talk quite a lot. Jump in, and if you have particular things you want to know about, push me. It's how I become a better teacher. So I welcome it. Okay, right, enough said. Right, I did mention the course book. So there is a course book. I haven't brought hard copies tonight, but I'm going to just put up, oh, okay. So can you at home see the Moodle page?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So this is the Preaching Theology, the Preaching Theology and Practice Moodle page. Looks a little bit different for me than it does for you, because I can edit the change, and there are things that I have hidden on here that will come up later in the course that I'll share with you. So there are a few differences, but this is your point of information for everything you might find. If I've sent out an email to you, do come and check on the emails. Did everyone manage to receive an email from? I did send it out on Monday. Did you get it on Monday? It says the email system here is notoriously bad. I came from Barbara. So weird.
Today.
Okay. Yeah, so there tends to be this delay and lag on it a little bit, which is quite frustrating. No, I'm not sure why you can't see anything with SOA. So it seems to be functioning for everyone else. I'll put it back up in a minute. So anyway, course information. So here, the course outline, I'm going to come to this in just a minute and we'll talk about it. But you can click on that and download it. There tend to be always one or two typos tend to sneak through. So I do update it from time to time. For those of you on Zoom, the link, I do send it out from time to time, but you can always find it here. It's the same link for every lecture every week. So, and if for those of you, if you end up sick or in another part of the country, as happens from time to time, the Zoom link's there. There's a chance because sometimes I end up out of Auckland, and on those weeks I will send you all an email saying tonight's only on Zoom, and this is where you come to find the Zoom link. If you can, look, again, the Zoom link is there because people, primarily Zoom is for people outside of Auckland. If you're able to be here in person, that's better, particularly in those final 2 weeks coming and doing your final assignments and classes better. If it's hard because of work commitments and those sorts of things, like use the Zoom link if you need to. There are people on Zoom, so I'll just be honest, it's just easier for me to teach face to face. Yeah, absolutely. So it's dropped out of the thing again. Let me back in. So, sorry, I was talking about this page. Okay, so the Zoom link's there. Yeah, use it if you need to. Okay. If you can, generally give me a heads up, that's great. But if you can be in person, it's just a better experience to be in the classroom as a rule. Some of the various bits of things like assignment cover sheets, these are things that you'll find here. I'll leave those for you to dig through. Some, don't worry about this feedback form yet, that we'll get to that later in this thing, but there's some guide around style and these sorts of things. This section here is where you submit your assignments. You'll see here already, oh, there are 3 assignments coming up. We'll talk about those in a minute. Readings, look, here you can download the course book. You can click on it. I'll talk about the book a little bit more, but as I say, for those of you who are in person next week, I'll have hard copies that you can loan available. But for everyone else, by all means, jump in and download it. It's some of us just like a hard copy better. The nice thing about the electronic copy is you can download it and keep it forever, which means it's a resource that goes into your brain. There are some weeks we're going to use it quite closely, so other weeks not so much. But there's lots of material in this book which I think is quite useful. It's aimed at a really broad range of preaching experience, from those who are beginning to those who've been preaching for a while but are looking to add some aspects to their preaching. So even though we'll dip in and out of it over the course, it's something that you can hang on into the future. And then, because particularly for those of you who are earlier in your preaching life, you might find after a few years you think, well, I've gotten to a bit of a groove and I'm a bit more comfortable, but I'm looking to just expand how I do it, to find a different ways, to try a different style. There are some great tips in there. We'll refer to it. I'll leave it for you at this stage to download it, to have a bit of a look. For yourselves, we're going to use a couple of the questions out of the first worksheet this week, and I think I'm going to ask you to, I'm just trying to remember, read chapter 2 for next week. It's a PDF, so yeah, I imagine you can. Yes, I haven't even tried to print it, so because I have hard copies and after this electronic version, but the electronic version is there for you to take and use, so that's great. There are a couple other little readings there that come up later in the course. You'll see hidden from students. That's because I haven't let you see it yet. There'll be some other videos that come from the course that I will share with you in due course for you to again refer back to. So there are some things there, and here you'll see, oh look, lecture slides. So you can download those there. That one's already available. Next week isn't yet, because we'll get to that next week. I don't need you looking ahead. I might change my mind about what I want to talk about next week. So I always give myself an out in that regard. And down the bottom of the Moodle page, this is where, because I'm recording the class, I will upload it tomorrow. Zoom videos are not great quality. After the course is finished, I do tend to go back and delete them all because I hate seeing videos of myself. It's something we're all going to have to face in this course, because I am going to record you doing preaching, because it's a really valuable thing for feedback. And it is a good thing for preachers to get comfortable seeing themselves. Because when we see ourselves filmed, we learn all sorts of uncomfortable things about ourselves. The uncomfortable thing I always learn about myself whenever I see a video of myself preaching is that I'm about maybe 3% as charismatic as I actually think I am, which is pretty rough thing to, as I say, a pretty big discrepancy between I do think I'm very charismatic, and then I see myself preaching and it's like, ooh, I am not the rock star of preaching that I imagine. My preaching voice. It's probably quite like my teaching voice. Even more, okay, because even I'm using my teaching voice right now, which is great. So Grace has just pointed out that my preaching voice is quite different to my speaking voice. Well, it's true, but to be fair, it's formal. It is formal. That's true. Oh, really? So as I said, we discover uncomfortable truths. Okay, you will have an opportunity. Okay, so we'll get to this in the course outline in just a moment, but you will all have an opportunity to critique me as the course progresses. This is a new thing we're doing this year. I'm going to give you a chance to actually really tell me how bad I am before I do that to all of you. It only seems fair. If I'm subjecting you all to having to preach, you should actually get a taste of just how good or not I actually am. We will get to that later on. So course outline, we're gonna, sorry, I'll just change what I've got here and bring up the course outline. So if I hang on everyone at home. If any of you are not on the Moodle page yet, the person to talk to is Barbara. Barbara will load you on and tell you how to use it and how to access it. It's particularly important in terms of uploading your assignments. You do need to upload them to Turnitin. I'll talk about Turnitin in a minute. Oh, no, maybe I'll mention it now. So is everyone familiar with Turnitin? No, some aren't? Okay. So one of the issues that we face is cheating. Okay. And so cheating in the context of this course is taking someone else's work or sermon, whether it's from an online source or from another class member or from someone who's done the course before or from someone from a university, and pretending it's your work. That's cheating. That's called, the technical word for that is plagiarism. So it's just taking forever for my document to open. So Turnitin, yeah, it's this horrible one word thing. So it's a computer program, and what it does, and I'll explain it to you because not lots of lecturers don't seem to explain what it does. Sorry, my computer's just having a hard time because I've asked it to do so many things. Oh, no, there we go. There we go, course outline. So we'll get to this in just a moment. So what Turnitin does is that everyone uploads an electronic copy of their assignment onto Turnitin. You basically just drag and drop it onto the Moodle page. So you click onto that where the assignments are on the Moodle page. It will tell you how to do it. It's not particularly difficult. If you find it hard, you just email it to me and I'll put it up online for you. It's not a big deal. It's pretty straightforward. What Turnitin then does is that it scans its database of, it compares all of your work to each other. That's the first thing it does. So if two of you have sat there and worked together on assignment, you've written basically the same thing, it will say, oh, look, these two people have worked together. If it will also look at all of the past assignments that have been submitted to this course and go, oh, such and such talked to Jeremy who did it last year and they borrowed his assignment. And so it will tell me if you've done that. It then also looks at everything that's online and anything that's basically come up in similar courses at other universities. So it looks very, very widely. And the other thing that it does now too, is it says, this assignment looks like it wasn't written by a human being, meaning it was written by ChatGPT or some other form of artificial intelligence, and therefore that is also considered a form of cheating. So if you do that, and the thing is, I hate to say it, ChatGPT is really good at producing stuff that looks like it's smart and clever and accurate, but actually a lot of the time it's just lying. And that's why other things like Turnitin can find those errors and go, well, this wasn't written by a human. So just, and if you don't know what I mean when I talk about ChatGPT or AI, look, I barely understand those things. I only understand it because I had a friend who wrote a very helpful little pamphlet on what it is and what's at stake that I went and read, that I have actually a grasp of it. So it's, if you don't know about it, that's fine. Just leave it alone. Don't go there. It's a good thing not to know about in terms of academic work. Okay. So that's a little thing about Turnitin, but it's good to know how that works. I'll come back with the slides and just make some points about plagiarism in a bit. But here is the course outline. This is the stuff that you're probably all burning to know about. Okay. So some of you will have already had a look on and downloaded this already. I'm just going to go over it very quickly to explain a little bit more about each assignment primarily. And the other thing is that as we get closer to each assignment being submitted, I'll spend more time speaking in class in detail on what my expectations are. But this is a once over lightly at the start of the course. This will of course be on the video, so you can come back to it and watch it later. If things that I say now go over your head, you can come back and refer to it. But it's always good to get a bit of an overview. This is the best email address to contact me on if you have questions, if you have issues. If you're wanting to plead for an extension on assignment, extensions in this course is quite hard, particularly the final assignment. They are presentations in class and you do need to come to class to complete the course. It gets very tricky if you don't come to the final 2 weeks of class, but we'll get to that. So anyway, basic course information here. You can read that yourselves in your own time. Stuff about here is a guide to more or less the pattern of what we'll be doing over the coming weeks. So you'll see this week, Introduction to Preaching, the workbook, chapters 1 and 2. There you go. As I say, I'll ask you to, I won't have expected you to have read them by now, but in the week following, to read these things. Generally, with this course, you can come and do the lecture and then do the reading as a follow-up to get a different perspective on the things that I've said, because the book does talk about things differently. I have particular biases in terms of what I think, well, no, just in terms of what I think the important points are. And sometimes the book looks at it a bit differently. So it's good to have those different perspectives. So as you can see, a topic and the references. We're primarily using this, you can see here, plus additional handouts. So there is, again, that will be available on the Moodle page. Yeah, again, here, same additional handout that's on the Moodle page. So this goes through our topics. So we have, here we go. Next week, the role of the Bible in preaching, kind of quite foundational, how we deal with scripture and some approaches to it, particularly coming from a Methodist perspective on that. Imagination in preaching, it's creative approaches. Context, which is congregation, who are you speaking to? Issues around that. There are some different forms of preaching, meaning this is how you organize your material, whether you create a particular structure, because there are lots of different structures in terms of how people can go about it. Oh, there you go, theology of preaching. I wonder what I meant by that. We'll come back to that. I do wonder what I mean by that. Okay, I have to check my notes. Some stuff around using digital media, so using screens and presentations and so on, some particular thoughts around that. We will touch on preaching in the Methodist tradition. And here, week 9, critiquing the lecturer. So what's going to happen in this class is I'm probably here in class going to give 2 or 3 different sermons that I have given in different contexts at different times. And this will be an opportunity for you to see how I do it, how I've structured things differently, an opportunity for you to go did that work, didn't it work, what will we do differently, and so on. So it's as I say, it's an opportunity for you guys to see what you think in terms of someone who, I don't say this in a kind of arrogant, weird way, but I have done a lot of preaching. I began preaching before I was ordained. I've been ordained for almost 20 years. In particular, when I was in a parish context, I was a working preacher, meaning I preached almost every week for long periods of time, which is a particular role that some of you might end up in terms of having to do and having to produce new content, new ideas week after week after week is a very particular task. I'll be honest, just a little pet peeve here. One thing that used to really bug me when I was a working preacher is that occasionally I had a few people available who would do a guest preaching slot, meaning that they might come and preach once a year. And they would come and preach once a year and they would preach something amazing because they had had an entire year to think about it since their last sermon, okay? And unsurprisingly, particularly if you're someone who does a lot of public speaking and other forms of life, when you've had a long period of time between presentations, you can pour a lot more of yourself into it in a way that someone who's doing it week after week after, it's a really different challenge to keep it fresh, to keep people engaged. But there are also really big rewards to having a conversation with a community that lasts over a long period of time. Because even though each week might not be quite as flashy as those big one-off events where people come in and preach, you can build and build and build and end up in some really interesting places that you can only do when you are building not just a preaching relationship with a community, but the pastoral aspect of that. Because there is a real pastoral aspect to being a regular preacher in a context. It's about building trust and rapport. And there is an aspect where once you have proven yourself to a community as a preacher who is trustworthy, that is actually the point where you can begin to take more risks as a preacher. Because once you have established that, you can actually start going, and there are various ways we'll talk about over this course where you can start going, well, I know when we have this particular set of readings about the Good Shepherd and we say these things about it, and I know that's what you expect. Okay, because one of the things I hear from my students, and I won't say which ones, but often I will get feedback from, where I share a sermon idea and students say, Richard, that's really interesting and that's exciting that you can do it, but we could never give that sermon to our congregation. Well, I would say, yes, you can, but you need to build towards it. That might not be a starting point, but might be a point you can get to. Because when you build up trust and rapport with a community over a period of time, sometimes you can reach a point where you say, okay, you've heard me talk about this before, but actually I have a different idea today. And you don't have to like it, but I'm going to share it, and here it is. And suddenly there'll be a group of people in that community who go, I was ready to hear something new today. I really like that. And then you can start introducing more and more new thoughts. Because that's one of the things I think particularly new preachers really struggle with. And look, some church communities can be very, very clear of what their expectations of a preacher are. This is how it's always been spoken since time immemorial. Well, yeah, exactly. Since Moses. So Moses gave this sermon, and every preacher I've ever known has said exactly the same thing, and don't you stray from it. Well, and it is a trap and it's a hard thing to get, but there are ways of doing it. And again, building trust over time means you can take people to a new place. So anyway, that's the thought. Right, so critiquing the lecture, there'll be an opportunity to do that. And then the final 2 weeks are given over to your final assignments where you give a sermon. And as I say, it's a double round. So 5th and 12th of October, these are critical dates that you do need to be present in class for. And I'll talk in more detail, but essentially what happens is on the 5th of October, you come with a sermon prepared that you will give in class. Other class members will give you some feedback on this sermon, and so will I. You then have 1 week to go away and to rewrite You'll take your material, rewrite it, and then give a final version of it. And the final version is the one that gets graded. Okay, so you get 2 rounds of it. This does happen in some church settings. Look, when I was a full-time parish minister, I had an 8 o'clock service on a Sunday morning, and I had a 9:30 service on a Sunday morning. And sometimes I had a smaller congregation of about 20 people at that 8 o'clock service, and they would get the draft version of my sermon. And then between the 2 services, I would make it a lot better. And then the 9:30 congregation would get a better sermon, which isn't ideal. Ideally, it's just good at both services, but there were times where I just went, crumbs, for whatever reason. I was busy. I've written down ideas and they just didn't quite flow properly, or there's a mistake here, or crumbs, this is just full of spelling mistakes, or actually my ending just wasn't the right one. I didn't end in the right place. That was quite a common one for me. So that half an hour I had between services would often be a time where I would sit there and rewrite to make my sermon better. But the idea was to turn up with something that's good the first time. That's sort of the goal.
Can I ask you, would you ever find yourself doing definition?
Okay, so okay, so the question is around, for those listening on Zoom, so I'm just going to repeat so that they can hear, is about emotions in preaching and how we deal with those. So we will spend some time talking about that and the difference between a thinking sermon and an emotional sermon. So we'll have a week where we talk about when we look at the congregations in that week, we're going to look at personality types a little bit, because I am a thinking type rather than an emotional type personally. So I know that. And I'm aware that my tendency will to be give kind of more intellectual. Yeah, that's my typical style. What I've had to learn to do as a preacher is to sometimes engage my emotions, because there are some people who operate emotionally and they're waiting for that content. Okay, they're wanting it to be, because if I just keep giving the same, and again, that's one of the things that I have to vary, is to find emotional content that works. There are dangers in it, because sometimes if I share a story that I find emotional, that can affect my performance. And I'm sure Grace will just admit to this, that there are times where my voice has broken in a sermon because suddenly I'm feeling the emotion of it and I haven't quite got it down. And suddenly my voice just gives away that I might be feeling something. Okay. So that does happen. There are ways of dealing with it. The big one for me is to practice. If I have, and like there's a story that I'm going to share with you in a particular week. It's actually a children's story, but I've used it in preaching quite a lot. But it has a real emotional resonance for me. And I'm at a point, because it's a story I've read to my children many times. I've used it in sermons a whole bunch of times. It connects with me very deeply, but I now find I get quite emotional at the end of it every time I read it, to the point that I'm having to sort of rest my use of it, because I do get emotionally caught up in it. So I'm having to judge it for myself. Now, my way of dealing with that before was I would practice and practice and practice till essentially what I'd say is I became emotionally dead to it. So I'd rehearse it enough times that I wouldn't have an emotional reaction to it. It's not a great way of dealing with it. Sometimes you just have to make a decision and doing it. Like, I think there's something really important about the preacher being in command of the role of parent. Like, preaching is a position of trust in a community, and yeah, and people, you've got to live up to that. And it's not that I'm anti being emotional, because I'm clearly not. I think there's a time to engage, but there's also appropriate ways of engaging emotions where I don't lose control and other people don't lose, because that's creating a situation that's vulnerable in a context where it's not easy to deal with that vulnerability. If I get a really strong emotional reaction, but then it's a communion service and the service is going to go for another 30 minutes, but someone's in a really emotionally complex place in the middle, that's not good stewardship. That's not me caring for that community well. I don't think so. You have to think of the broader context when you're trying to do these things. Yeah. And again, the other thing that I would always ask myself is when I have a particularly creative idea, I'd always have to ask myself, who am I doing this for? Who am I doing this for? Am I doing it for me or am I doing it for them? And it's a really important question. You'll hear me say this quite a few times over the course. Who am I doing this for? It's an important question. If I've got a story, oh, this is a personal story. Maybe I'm at the place where I can share a personal story. Hang on, why am I doing it? Am I doing it because I'm still processing something? Because there are certainly plenty of times where I've written something into a sermon and I've gone, I feel really good. I've had this big breakthrough in my life and I sort of want to share it with everyone. And then I realize, oh, this sermon I'm writing is actually therapy for me. And I now need to ask whether it's appropriate to share the therapy I've been getting with everyone. And 9 times out of 10, the answer is no, it's not. I did that work for me. Yeah. So these are some things to be aware of. Occasionally, I'll get to that point and I go, yes, this was therapy for me, but I still think it might be what is right for this community in this time. But I'm going to go back and craft it to tell it in a way that's less about me and more about what more about. Yeah. So there are lots of judgment calls to be made, but I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about what we like and what we don't like in preaching in a few minutes. But one of the things one thing that I don't value in my own preaching or in other people's is what I would call self-indulgence, where someone's really gotten onto their own little thing. And look, we as preachers, we're all guilty of it sometimes. There are times where I have just indulged a little flight of fancy, maybe a little bit too far. Maybe I shouldn't have worked my fascination with zombies into this particular sermon. That has happened, okay? So we've all got to make those calls. And sometimes it's like, well, it was times, right? Isoa, do you have a question?
Yes, you know, on the 5th of October, it's written in the sermon presentation.
Yeah.
Do we need to come and present, or do we need to present on that 5th of October? Or is it the due date of presentation?
Okay, so I'll explain this in just a second. Oh, okay, so sorry, I got a bit distracted. We'll come back, I'll talk about all of the assignments in turn, and then we should hopefully be clear by the end of that, okay? So I'm gonna come back to the form now. Sorry, this happens sometimes. We'll, here we go. So we're gonna move on to this. So, okay, there are 3 assignments to look at. Now, the first is quite simple. It's, well, simple. You've got to do the work, you tell me. But what this is this is a sermon outline. This is not writing a sermon. I'm going to be really clear about that. It's not writing a sermon. Okay, so you'll read through this. Now, the way this assignment works, assignment 1, is that there is a scenario here where it is a difficult one. You can let me know if this scenario is too difficult for you, but involves being in a community where a young person has taken their own life and that you're asked to say something into this context. Now, this is unusual, but believe it or not, it does happen. It's something that has happened in my ministry more than once, and it is a very tricky thing to happen. So I've taken this now because it's real. It is a real situation. And that you've got to kind of craft something that hits a whole lot of very sensitive things. And when you're approaching a situation like this in which you've been asked to preach, sometimes the first step is to think really carefully around what are all the issues here, what are the potential potholes, where are the places where I might just go off the rails or get into some trouble or say the wrong thing. What are those areas of concern? What are the things that really need to be said? How do I want this to come out? And so sometimes we do need to put some really careful planning into how we're going to do it before we actually write for the actual event. And that's what this assignment's trying to do. So it gives you a scenario, and then I've got 3 explicit points that tell you exactly, which are what are here, which tell you exactly how to do this. So if you follow these 3 points and you do it, Yeah, I try to break these assignments down so that they're as clear as possible, so you all know what my expectations are. Okay, so you'll see the first thing is describe your knowledge of and relationship to the deceased person. Include any details you know of their family and whether there are any pastoral issues that need to be taken into account at the funeral. This part of the assessment is about recognizing and responding to your context. So that's the first thing you're going to do. It's imaginative. You're building up a story. You're making this up like it's meant to be made up, okay? I don't want you to touch on something that was really real for you, because I don't need you to be walking through a whole lot of personal grief. Okay, I'm not asking you to do that, but I'm asking you to imagine what this is like. And as I say, I do say this with some sensitivity, because I'm sure for some of you in class, suicide in some form or another has been part of your story. It has been part of mine, and I know that it's difficult. But as I say, it's also a real situation that those in ministry, those who are preachers, might be in this context and need to respond in this way. The second part is to select 2 biblical passages for your sermon to be based on. And you need to, so again, really tricky, but you need to think about what are the right things and how are they going to feed into what it is that needs to happen in this situation. So you identify the key theological message of your sermon and what it is you want people to take away from it, and you describe that in some detail. Yes. Absolutely. Like the exciting thing is that this is a Methodist context, and so you can tweak readings. Yeah, I mean, so the question, sorry, Grace's question was around, in selecting the readings, can you tweak the readings to really fit well with your sermon? Look, the lectionary, and we're going to talk about the lectionary next week, what the lectionary is, but for those of you who are familiar with what this is, the lectionary is a set of readings that are set down for each Sunday. And there's a big history to that, as I say, that's in next week's class, and talking about where that comes from and what, but the lectionary is made it wasn't handed down to God by Moses, who then passed it on and said, here it is, everyone, the Revised Common Lectionary. This is how you're to read the Bible in church. No, it was made by panels of scholars who had all sorts of ideas about what reading should be read when, and they had all sorts of agendas about how that should go. So they've already actually, even if we follow the lectionary, you've got to be aware that there's a whole lot of editing work that's gone on. And we actually find in the lectionary, there are all sorts of offensive verses that are cut out, that are left out. There are some books in fact, there's an entire book of the Bible which has one verse read once every 3 years in the lectionary, and that's it. There's an entire book of the Bible that's almost omitted from our reading cycle. Okay, so as I say, I'll talk more about that next week. But the point that I'm making in response to Grace's question is, if you're coming up with readings for this assignment and you essentially go, I really like Psalm 23, but I like the first 6 verses and I like the last 4 verses, then that's the reading you choose. Okay, so you designate it that way. So say, well, but those verses in the middle don't really fit this context. So again, why read them? This is a pastoral situation, and you're responding in the most way. So again, or you might go 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but actually there are a couple of verses there at the end that give it straight. Maybe I'll just have selections from that, and that's fine if that's what works. The other thing you can consider now, here at Trinity, we would have a tendency towards encouraging you to use the New Revised Standard Version translation. That's because we as a college consider that to be the best translation available. Okay, so there is we do favor that translation, but here's the proviso that I'll give you for this assignment. If you compare that translation and you say, but actually in this context, I think the story I'm told is told better in a different version because it phrases it slightly different in a way that's going to connect with this audience better, you can argue that in your assignment and say, this is why I've chosen this version of this reading because it meets this need better. It's not a case of just going and doing it because I like the NIV translation better than the NRSV. That's not what I'm asking. I'm saying justify it. Say, look at the two different versions, and this is why I think this one fits the situation better. So you can do that in your work. Okay. I mean, generally people would have a reluctance to change gender, for example. Often lots of scholars would have that. In this course, I'm going to say, actually, no. I think things need to fit the context, and if you can have if you want to gender neutralize a particular verse because you want to make it more universal, actually, again, that's something that I think is justifiable in a pastoral context. This is a particular situation where you are trying to, and this sermon, this is a pastoral context, this scenario. So I think there are, and just because I know Grace is asking a little bit from the Anglican perspective, that is an Anglican answer to, if this is a pastoral context, you can massage things to just fit a little bit more smoothly and comfortable, to be a bit broader. Where we tend to get more rigid is around Sunday worship, in terms of let's follow that and kind of deal with the problems that are there. It's a slightly different one. Okay, so that's sort of assignment one in a nutshell. It's a sermon outline. I will talk a bit more about it closer to the time. You've got, as I say, it's not due till, so like 6 weeks away. It's ages. Nope, nothing to do with it. This is just one assignment. This is it. Nothing to do with the final one. Okay. Assignment 2. This is the big one. Okay. Oh, look, the other thing I just say is, look, I put this is the assessment rubric. Again, something I didn't work out to ever do as a student until I was at university for the second time. So I didn't work it out the first time I tried to go to university. This is where the marks are allocated. Okay, this is what it tells you. So details of deceased and pastoral issues relating to their family context. Look, that's worth 10% of your grade. So in a 1,000-word essay, if you spend 600 words telling me about the family and coming up with an elaborate story, you've spent 600 words to get 10%. Okay. Oh, look at this selection of biblical texts. Oh, that's worth 30%. Okay. You want to spend some more time telling me about why these are the right versions, why you chose them, what they say, why that's important. So much more description involved here, because that's where more marks are. Same thing here, key theological message, 40%. So between these 2 points, 70%, that's where most of your writing goes. Okay. I don't mean this in a condescending way. This is the trap my students in this course tend to fall into. They spend a lot of time coming up with a very elaborate story and all of the insightful things and really fleshing out, which is great, but you need to do these other parts really well, because that's actually where the marking is allocated to. Okay, so this is the core bit of the assignment, are really these 2 parts. Evidence of course reading, and there you go, written expression. But yeah, just do look at your marking schedule for all of these assignments, because it does really direct where more of your energy should go. Right, so sermon preparation and delivery. This is the big assignment, and as you can see here, this is where we've got the 2 dates, October 4th and October 11th. So I'll explain, we'll come to those dates in a minute, and then I'll explain this. Right, prepare and deliver 1 sermon on 1 set of the following readings from the lectionary. So option 1, it's this one, Ezekiel and then the Matthew reading. Option 2 is Psalm 16 and John. Option 3 is Genesis and then Matthew. So there are 3 different choices. Pick 1 set. Don't pick all of them. Don't mix and match. Okay, these are drawn from the lectionary. These readings go together. Okay, often for really bad reasons. I'm not going to say that might be one of the things you got to deal with, but it gives you 2 readings to work with. The Revised Common Lectionary actually gives 4 readings on a Sunday, but I have selected these ones because I think these are the ones that make easiest to deal with. There are some preaching traditions that say if you have 4 readings, you should touch on all of them. I don't agree with that tradition. Okay, I come from a tradition of preaching that says always use the gospel reading, and if possible, touch on the others if it works, if it makes sense to do that. Okay, but always read all of them, see where inspiration comes. but the gospel is the focus of the message, because we are a Christ-centered church, and the gospel is where we find Christ. Okay, so that's quite a big hint around my bias and my expectation in terms of where this final assignment might go. I will talk more about this again over the next few weeks, but that's the direction I come from. So I'm owning that as my perspective. That said, you might have a crackingly great sermon that comes out of that Ezekiel writing. And if it is a crackingly good sermon, you're not going to lose grades because I prefer sermons that are based on the Gospels, okay? But as a general rule, I think preaching is focused on the Gospels. And that said, I also acknowledge that there are some weeks in my preaching life as a working preacher where I've gone, no, I actually tell you, I'll be very specific. So I've, as I say, I'll talk more about the lectionary and describe it in more detail next week. But there is a particular period in the 3-year cycle, and it's after Easter in one of the years, I think it's in year C, where there is, and I got caught out the first time I had to do this. So there's a series of readings from the Gospel of John following Easter, where Jesus talks about, on week 1, Jesus talks about, I am the bread of life. And then the week after that, Jesus talks about, I'm also the bread of life in these different ways. And then the week after that, Jesus also talks about, guess what? I am the bread of life. And this goes on for 6 weeks that Jesus talks about, I am the bread of life. And the first time I had to preach through that part of the lectionary, I gave all my great I am the bread of life thoughts on week 1. Because I didn't know that there were going to be another 5 weeks of Jesus talking about I am the bread of life. And I didn't, I went, what am I going to do? Oh, well, I guess I'll be preaching on the other readings. Okay, so that happened because I hadn't experienced the lectionary really well. I didn't quite realize that this theme, the people who put the lectionary together were so passionate about it that they, sorry, we'll take a 5-minute break in a minute. I'll just get through the assignments. Yeah, I hadn't realized that they were so enthusiastic about this theme of I am the bread of life and felt it was so important that they gave us weeks and weeks and weeks of it. Okay. But sometimes, as I say, so that's one example where I made a bit of a mistake, used all my really good material on week 1. And then it's like, well, fortunately, there are other readings that I can talk about. So talk more about the other readings. Even in years where I've hit that stretch and I've known it, again, I've still gone, well, there's still only so much that can be said on this particular theme, and I've used a lot of that material in the past. So again, I need to find some creative ways of doing it. So there is some wiggle room around the general principle of always preaching in the gospel. And sometimes you do just find a gospel reading where you go, I don't know what to do with this. This is strange. I've read a bunch of stuff. I'm feeling uninspired, but heck, the Old Testament readings are following the story of King David, and there's some juicy material there. That's where we're going to go. So that's where, yeah, that's it. There are 3. Now, be grateful. I used to only give 1, but that made it really painful for me when there are 9 of you and you all preach on the same readings. So I'm hoping that roughly 1/3 of the class will do each set. That's what I'm hoping. I'm sure there are favorite readings here that people will identify, so we'll probably end up with more of one of them, but I have given the 3 choices. Okay. No, you choose. You go, you read these readings, you think about them, you go, that's the set that I've got an idea on. Okay, so no, it is up to you, but I am restricting you to them. No, better than one. So you prepare your sermon, and yeah, on October the 4th, you come to class and you will probably come and sit where I am. You will speak it to the class. We don't get too much into the actual performance of it too much, just because you've got people online and you need to be inclusive of everyone. So, but you come and you give your sermon to the best of your ability, and this is actually going to relate to the next assignment. So as I say, on October the 4th, at the conclusion of your sermon, I will give you a bunch of comments of, I thought this worked really well. Here's what you might want to think about. here are a couple of thoughts that I think you might want to include. It might be something like, I gave you assigned readings and you spent a whole bunch of time trying to demonstrate your biblical knowledge by talking about 7 other readings as well. That's not what this assignment did. I've given you the readings I want you to talk about. Because again, that's another thing that does happen in some church tradition, particularly in Pentecostal churches. Quite often we'll go, it's what's called proof texting, and it's a little bit of a flex. I know the Bible really well, and I can now, but quite often the connections being drawn aren't as solid as some people would make out. I don't think that's good preaching. Again, it's not about demonstrating I'm not looking for you to touch on every book of the Bible to show that you have a good knowledge of where all these different ideas are. No, because the task of preaching is to be focused. I'm looking for you to take the message from one of these readings I've given you and to give depth. So not once over the Bible lightly, but take a small part of the Bible and go deep into that story. That's what the task here is. Okay. Yeah, so I'll get to the critique in just a moment, but yes, they do. Yes, they do. So anyway, I'll finish off talking about this one. So you'll give it in class. I will give you this feedback, and then I think probably one other student in class will have been given the assignment of also filling out a form, a feedback form about your thing. So the week before we do this, I will essentially give you a list of saying, right, Anna, you're going to give feedback on SOA, and you're going to listen attentively. You're going to fill out this form. You'll have time to fill out that form more detail, but I will give comments, and then I'll invite the other students to say, do you have any observations that you'd like to make at this stage that you'd like to share with the student that you've just listened to from your perspective? And they can share those things, and then you go away with my thoughts and your fellow students' thoughts ringing in your ears and going, right, how am I going to take that advice and make this even better? Okay, I'm sure your first week will be good. I will have given you a lot of ideas of how to do this assignment by the time you get to it. Okay, because that's what the next 6 weeks is about me giving you all the different ways of trying to tackle this. Yeah, okay. So the idea is, like, the way I like to think of this course is, we all need a toolbox for preaching. And a toolbox is, here are the different things I can think about. Here are the different approaches I can give. Here's how I can think about engaging the emotions. Here's how I can use scripture. Here's, there's a whole raft of things. And so there's a whole lot of different styles I can think about. These are all different things that go into your toolbox. And not every sermon is going to require all of those tools, but they're there so that you can keep growing as a preacher over time. Because sometimes, like, as I say, even really good preachers tend to get into a bit of a rut after a while, and we need to shake things up again and go, I need to break out of this and do something that I'm not so comfortable doing so that I'm still growing. So that's what the course is trying to do, is to give you a whole bunch of different ideas. Now, you're not going to be able to use all of those ideas in this assignment, but you're going to be able to use some of them. You'll be able to use some of them. And there are some particular things I'm going to hit really hard in this course. I'm going to talk about storytelling a lot, okay, in this course. It's something I'm looking for you to pick up on and run with. But we'll, as I say, again, we've got lots of weeks ahead of us before we get to that. So yeah, so that's the way assignment works, is that you'll be in class, you'll get feedback from me, you go away, and you come back and you give it a second time. And then that's the one, the written version that you submit me, that's the one that I ultimately mark. I take some consideration for the way in which you have taken the feedback from the previous week and actually incorporated it into your review thing. And because I will film you doing these presentations, I have a record to do it. And that is part of the process, is that I will film you and that I will make those available to you through the Moodle page, videos that will be deleted after the course, so that you can see yourselves and actually see some of the things that I talk about and take it from there, okay? It is scary, but I promise you, and look, when I had to go through this, when I was a student, when I was totally, yep, it was really scary, but I learned so much from having this opportunity to actually take some lessons to do something more than once, because it was a chance to get better. And again, a chance to get better without a congregation of people that I really kind of want to impress, and I want them to think I'm a good preacher. Yeah, this isn't that, there isn't that pressure here in this classroom. We're all learning, we're all in it together, we're all getting better. And so we can be supportive of each other and try some things out. Okay. Right, so yeah, the last, so that's the major assignment. The again, the information there, and the sermon critique, this happens in class. So as I just explained, you'll be given a form, again, closer to the time. I'll give you the form so you can prepare and you can go, these are all the different things that I've got to look for. You write them out. So you get to do it on the night, you get to make a bunch of notes, you then get to write it out more fully and submit it in the following week as an assignment. So it doesn't, sorry, I haven't made that clear. You don't hand it in at night, you can go away and tidy it up. And I know if I take notes, it's really my notes look like some ancient language that no one can interpret other than me. That's not what I want to hand in as an assignment. So I don't expect you to do that, but you can make your rough notes and then go away and tidy it up so that I can read it and interpret it afterwards, okay? So there we go. That's the 3 assignments. Any questions about how those are going to work at this stage? Okay. That was a lot. I'm sorry, I've taken quite a long time to get through that stuff. I find it's just good to be really thorough at this stage so that it's there. I'm going to suggest we take 5 minutes and then come back and we'll talk a little bit more about some of our preferences around preaching. So let's take 5. We'll come back at past and jump into the next part of class. So we won't spend too much time on this, but I've just drawn a couple of questions from the first exercise in chapter 1 of the workbook that you guys will go and all look into after class. So look, we might just skip over this. I'm going to leave this for you guys to do in your own time. I think this is a worthwhile exercise. I think yeah, go away and think about these things, because it's really useful, and we might come back to this at the start of next week, to think about your expectations of preaching. Because it's always good for us. Like, I think most of us, we will have had experiences of good preaching, experiences of bad preaching, and what are they? And so I will just commend this to you. I think I think we will come back to this at the start of next week, because it's a useful thing to talk about. But I realize I've spoke for ages about the course outline, so we won't do it tonight. We all have preachers who have influenced us, people that we've looked up to. I have quite a small list, actually, of people that I consider to be really good preachers. Yeah, and yeah, it is quite a small list. I can probably count on about one hand the people that who I've personally known, who I've gone and heard multiple times and gone, they really have something really worthwhile. I know a lot of pretty good preachers, but I'm talking about like really excellent ones where I go, oh, I kind of want to be like them when I grow up, sort of people. So there's a very small group. There are a lot of people I know who are really competent and really good, but they don't necessarily reach me every single time. Now that's because of who I am. It's not necessarily that they'll have a bunch of people who go, oh, I think they're really excellent too. But I also know, and sadly, more often than not, my experience of hearing other people preach is, oh, this was hard work. And sometimes there are people who are very, very experienced who can still just make really terrible errors. So, as I say, look, in a sentence or two, a positive experience of preaching. Back in the day of the Parachute Music Festival, believe it or not, and I was an attendant in the very early days of that festival before it came north to the Waikato. but I met a preacher there who I heard, who actually was recently in touch with. And he said something very simple in the context of giving a presentation at that music festival. And he just said, look, if you really want to make sense of this Christianity thing, read the gospel and then read it again and then read it again. Because if you can make sense of who this person Jesus is for you, then that's a good start. And there you go. Years later, I remember that. I remember it really clearly because I took it to heart and I did it. And it's what became the foundation of my belief, was that I read the Gospels and then I read them again, and they are still, for me, the central part of Scripture that I return to all the time. For me, the Gospels are the lens through which we understand it. So I've got to say that, and believe it or not, this guy, his name is Buckshot, which is a funny name. He's an ex-bikie, and he's actually part of a Christian motorcycle gang based out of Wellington. And I got in touch with him last year and I said, just because he's involved in the Anglican Church now, and so I had mutual contacts, and I said, look, I'm really appreciative of those words, because they were pretty critical to me in my journey. So I've got to say that was a good sermon, because it had such a lasting impact, because it was a good piece of advice that I took and I lived with. Now, look, the next question here is to think about a negative experience of preaching. And again, I can very easily name the worst sermon I've heard. And this happened 20 years ago. It was at an ordination service for Anglican clergy, of which I was ordained not in this part of the country, I was ordained in Wellington. But I had come from Wellington to attend some friends who I trained with here in this institution, to their ordination, and I was there to support them. I'd been ordained the night before, and so then I came to be part of their ordinations, which was really fun. But the person who preached at this particular ordination service came at it with a very negative theology. And the theology that they preached on this night were people who have been training for many, many years, finally are being ordained, they're finally being recognized as future leaders and, well, present day leaders actually in the church. So it's a really major moment that many of us who enter into ministry can spend many, many years working towards this moment of, I am now a minister of the church, and kind of the fullness of what I thought it was going to be. So it's quite a huge emotional event, an ordination service. And the sermon that was preached essentially said, we are really sinful, terrible people. We are so utterly unworthy of God's love. The only reason we can even get out of bed at the beginning of the day, because we are such amazingly terrible people, is because God is willing to give us another chance. So that was the tone of the sermon given. Wasn't exactly a celebration. It was very much focused on, the unworthiness of us. And for me, again, that's not a message. And I know lots of people that's a potent theology in the history of the church, and for many people they feel that way, and it's a place from which they find strength. Yeah. For me, it's not a place I find strength from. The gospel message I find that resonates with me is, in fact, God saying, you are worthy, you are chosen, you are loved. And that's the sort of message on a day like that, where you're literally giving your life to the church. That's the sort of message I want to hear. So I just think it was like, and it's not to say that that sermon was utterly bad. Like, personally, doesn't connect with me. I've heard a lot of those sermons. Nope, it was just grim. We're just terrible. Yeah, it was. And again, just not the right thing at the right occasion, really. And as I say, there is a time and a place for that theology, but it's not at that occasion. So it was more than anything, that's what I'd say about that. So again, that one stood out very clearly to me. So look, go and have a look at that exercise, spend some time. Can you pick out the best sermon you've ever heard, or one that resonated? Not necessarily the best, but one that you go, actually, that sticks in my mind. Why does it stick in your mind? What was it about? Spend some time thinking about that. I hope that you can come back to class next week with something to share. And similarly, look at the negative one. What was the one where you just went, oh, crumbs? I mean, look, I've got another funny story with a preacher. This was when I was a child at church, actually. And I remember the story mostly because my parents were so scandalized about it, where a preacher got up and said, I've been trained, in my training, we were taught that all good sermons have 3 good points. And there is such a thing called 3-point sermon. We're going to cover it in a few weeks. So this is what this preacher said. I've been taught that all good sermons make three points. Today, I'm going to make 7, which was, but what a mistake. Like, he literally said, I know what a good sermon is, and I'm not going to do that. I mean, sort of self-defeating, right? So as I say, I don't personally remember that, but that story's been told in my family so many times, I have a memory of it anyway. The thing we're going to talk about quite a lot over the coming, we'll come back to, is that preaching is a theological exercise. And as such, so when we're preaching, for most people in ministry, this is the way, if you're a preacher, this is the way that you primarily write theology. And by theology, we're saying talking about God, thinking about God, thinking deeply about God. Like theology literally, more or less literally translates to God talk, how we communicate something of the reality of God, who we know God to be. And it's an exploration, it's a discovery, because the God I believe in tomorrow is not the same as the God I believe in today, because I will know more tomorrow. I will encounter God differently tomorrow, and my understanding of God continues to grow. I'm sure we can all reflect on, when I was young, I thought of God like this, and that is definitely not how I think about God now. My experience in ministry has been that God continues to grow. God keeps escaping my grasp because God just keeps getting bigger. I'm really glad about that, because the God I believed in when I was young was a pretty small God. Yeah, it was a pretty small God. Unfortunately, God keeps getting bigger, which is good, because my ideas and my understandings keep getting bigger too. And it's nice to know that God just outstrips me in that, and that there's more room for me to be me. Well, these are good things to know. But as such, preaching does involve our four pillars of theology, the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Who knows what they are? Our the 4 pillars that we draw upon in making theology. That's one of them. Tradition. Anglicans only talk about 3, and it's a huge mistake, because the 4th one's really important. They talk about the 3-legged stool, but the Wesleyan quadrilateral are like, hang on, there's another one. You've got respect. Oh no, goodness. Come on, respect. We don't need respect for theology. No, of course we need respect, but it's not one of the 4 pillars. What are the 4 pillars of theology in what's known as the Methodist or the Wesleyan quadrilateral? So one of them is tradition. We've got one. Hang on, what's that? Tradition, yes. Oh, that was the first one. You got tradition, yes. So tradition's one. What's that book we sometimes read in churches? Oh, there you go. What a thought. Okay, so scripture, tradition. Okay, the other ones are slightly more esoteric. Okay, reason. Well done. And then in Methodist thought, there's one more is added, and I think it's critical. Experience. Okay, so actually, yeah, well, but it is important how we live in this time and how we encounter God in this time, and what we want to say about God in this time is different to the generations that went before us. And God is still alive and moving and existing and encountering us today, and that counts. The story of Christianity is an evolving story. It's an ongoing story. It's not something that just happened to a bunch of people 2,000 years ago. It's happening to us here now. And so theology is still being written. It's being written in our lives. And that's a place where we can draw on our encounter with God and draw upon in our preaching. Okay, so these are the 4 places. And as I say, it's the intersection of all of these things is what doing theology is. So preaching is actually trying to mix all of these things together. lots of people seem to think preaching is about retelling stories from the Bible. If you're doing that, you're only doing one bit of the theological task. And in fact, you're probably not doing it very well. So it's often the case, okay? But scripture is certainly there, but it's about a quarter of what we should be doing. Because as I say, the tradition, the history of our churches, okay? The history of the Methodist Church is fascinating. It is a reforming movement. It begins within a denomination that can't contain it, and it becomes something else altogether. And while Methodist and Anglicans are still very similar in many respects, there are some respects in which we are very different. You know, and I'm glad that we still have a very close relationship, I think, and actually a growing closer relationship, I'd suggest. But you know, it's a really interesting story because you know, the Wesleys brought fresh perspective and understanding, and had a bunch of different values and different way of doing things that ultimately needed to find its own pathway. And that's really interesting, very interesting. So there are stories there about why that is and how that came to be and what the expressions are that are part of the richness of what makes Methodists Methodist. Because it's a particular way of thinking and viewing the world, and it is different to Anglicans. I can have some understanding and sympathy for it, but it's not my tradition. I'm an Anglican, okay? And my stories are different, but they're still worth telling as well, okay? So knowing what your tradition is, America, and as I say, there's also a continuity because, as I say, Methodists came from Anglicans who came from Roman Catholics, really, more than any others. You know, that we, and the Roman Catholic Church goes back to very early in Christian history. So there's this long continuity that really, I think, does stretch back to the early church through our different denominations. And all of that there is story and history that actually, there's all sorts of messages and things that can be drawn upon that are still relevant to us today. I think there's a really funny thing that happens in our time. I mean, let's just call it narcissism, where we think that any challenges that we're facing as a Christian community are somehow the biggest and worst that the Christian church has ever faced. I don't think that's entirely true. In fact, I don't think that's true very much of the time at all, because when you start learning about the tradition and where it's come from, you realize there are all sorts of horrific things that have happened to all sorts of Christian people throughout time. And yet the church has endured through many huge challenges and upheavals. And yes, it's become more diverse in many respects, but again, I'd see that as a positive. All of that stuff is there and can be drawn upon. There are all sorts of stories throughout the history of Christianity, which your congregation may well go, I never thought of it this way. Like that story from back then, understanding our history actually says something to us now. And that's one of the things you can do as a preacher, is make those connections. So understanding, yes, scripture is part of it, but the tradition is another really rich source, which I think most preachers that I hear is untapped. Most barely ever go there. And I think it's a missed opportunity because there's heaps of stuff there that can be done. Lots of preachers do, but again, there's good stuff to be found. Reason is really about our ability to draw all of these things together, how to make sense of it, how to construct things differently. So that's the more to do with the doing rather than drawing from a scientific thing. It's how we sort of operate. But experience is the other place, you know, it's our experience actually matters. The ways that I've encountered God, I've thought about things. And again, we'll talk a lot about self-disclosure in preaching over the course, because I can't tell my own stories all the time, even though I love telling my own stories all the time. It's not good for preaching. I've got to do it sparingly. Yeah, I can remember a parishioner saying to me, I don't read lots of autobiographies. He said, yeah, I don't read many of them. I read a few. But I said, what don't you like about it? And she said, it's the I factor. By which he meant it's someone telling their own story. It's just, I did this, and I did this, and I did this. And you reach a point where it's like, okay, it's clearly all about you. And I've read some autobiographies. There's one by a member of the Red Hot Chili Peppers that screams to mind, where it was very self-indulgent. And I was like, oh, I don't like this band anymore. After reading it, I went into it going, I'm a bit of a fan. And by the end, I was not. Anyway, that's a complete other story. Right, we're gonna talk about some ideas about preaching, just to really get some thoughts going before we finish up for the night. So, some hallmarks of good preaching. That's not what's actually going on in this picture at all. This is just as I say, here I'm not giving hard answers at all. It's just an opportunity to start thinking about some of the themes and the issues around preaching. I'm going to show a quick, I'm going to have to stop the share because I'm going to show a video clip. Hang on a second, everyone. I did not share the screen properly. Here we go. Right. So it says, good preaching is persuasive. I'm going to show you a very short video clip. And this is a video clip of a person, quite a famous New Zealander actually, trying to be persuasive. Yes. And then I'll tell you about this, where this came from. So this is the New Zealand Film Commission film. It came out in the 1990s, back in the 90s. I remember this well. So this is a person being persuasive.
I'm in a small town called Pukerua Bay in New Zealand. Behind me is the house of an elderly lady called Hannah Mackenzie. I've known Hannah all my life. She's a very close friend of my parents who live just 4 doors away. In fact, I remember coming to Auntie Hannah's gardens, as we call her, when I was about 7 years old and playing in these trees over here. I didn't know a lot about Hannah Mackenzie back then. I knew that she was a widow. Her husband had died many years before I was born. About a year ago, I had a call from my mother. She said I should drop in on Auntie Hannah sometime because she was wondering if I'd be interested in a lot of old films that she had stored in a shed at the bottom of her garden. I wasn't expecting much. Hannah described them as a lot of old home movies that her husband Colin had taken. I was expecting to maybe find a bunch of old home movies, drop them off at the film archive on my way home, and that would be the end of it. What I found sitting right here was an old chest. I opened the chest and I found the most extraordinary collection of films. These were 35mm films. The tins were rusty. There were strange names on them, Warrior Season, films I'd never heard of. I had no way of realizing the significance of these films at the time. We later discovered they were made between the turn of the century and the late 1920s by an extraordinary New Zealander, a man who has now got to join the ranks of the great film pioneers, a guy called Colin Mackenzie.
At the archive, we get a lot of film.
So this is the opening of this documentary. Is Peter Jackson being persuasive? Are you getting drawn into his story? Yeah, so he's a storyteller, right? He's drawing you in. So he's trying to make the case of, and like the timing was really interesting. Okay, so he said these films were made between 1900 and the 1920s. Okay. Almost no films were being made anywhere in the world at that time. All right. So he's essentially arguing that like this New Zealander in Pukerua Bay, quite close to where I grew up, was like one of the first filmmakers in the world. Okay, not just anywhere, but like literally in the world. And this documentary goes on to tell the stories, and they start showing bits of footage from these movies and so on. So quite interesting. So he's really drawing in and really making a case. Okay. So back in the 90s on television, like back in the days where we only had 3 TV channels, okay, TV1, TV2, TV3, and Sunday night they used to have a thing called Sunday Montana Theatre because it was sponsored by Montana, the wine brand, and it was very sort of like one-off drunk, but it was kind of like the HBO, like prestige TV of the time. It wasn't great prestige TV, but like, so all the sort of fanciest one-off movies and stuff would show on Sunday night on television, like 8:30, and this is where this documentary showed. And the next day, the news stories come out. So people watch this. We're really caught up with this amazing story of this pioneering filmmaker in New Zealand. And then it was revealed that it's completely and utterly a lie. Peter Jackson made up this story for fun. It was a hoax. Okay. Now, the thing that's quite clever about this, right at the beginning, where was he walking? He's not on a street. Yeah, past a house. What's he describing? Through the garden. Okay, so he's literally walking down the garden path. So there's an expression in English, being led down the garden path means you're being deceived. He was literally doing that expression. He was leading us down the garden path. So that was one of the clues he gave in his film, was a visual way of saying, see, I'm misleading you. I'm leading you down the garden path. Now, I don't think preaching is about deceiving. Okay, it's not deceiving. But there is an aspect of when you are trying to build rapport with a congregation of saying, here I am, you can trust me, we're going on a journey together, come with me, let's see where we go. And again, one of the best ways we can do that, and the most easy ways to do that, is we start by telling a story, because that's what he's doing. He's telling a story. Here's the story. All of you, I watched you, all going, you start off going, oh, why is Richard showing this? Oh, this is what, really? Is there a filmmaker? And you know, so you got totally drawn into it because he's telling the story, and you get drawn in because that's how human communication works. We tell stories, and if it's a good story, we get people's attention and their engagement. Okay, this is incredibly helpful in preaching. Okay, because we want people to listen to us, we want people to trust us, we want them to come on the journey with us. Just a thing. Okay, good preaching does not shy away from the difficult parts of scripture. What do you think? Sorry, you can't read the slide here. It's terrible. Hang on. Oh, yeah, so you can get the whole joke. There we go. Got to read the joke. She bears, there's nothing like the threat of evisceration to keep rebellious youth group kids in line.
Yeah, see, I was going to say, because where I came from, I want to, think about what I grew up in.
Yes.
And I love that. And so when we ask, look at salvation, I used to, what is their money? Everything should be told to them. But obviously, it's a side of it. If it's too, it's too
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think no, you're expressing two sides of the coin.
Yeah,
you know.
And Methodist and where I come from now, I'm very that maybe you know, because they're teaching how I think it's important to know.
Yeah.
This is how it is. This
Yeah.
is how it is. And this is how it is.
Yeah.
If you want someone, your mother's telling you, right, in the first college, even
Yeah. 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 No, I like what you're pointing to, because you're pointing to this. I mean, look, there's a pastoral reality, right? And some bits of scripture are difficult. Some bits are incredibly difficult. So like, that's what, for those who don't get the reference, and some of you might not, because I've already talked to you about, I've already mentioned around the lectionary. The lectionary does omit certain difficult parts of scripture. And this is one of the stories that is omitted. It does not appear in the lectionary. It doesn't get read in church. It's the story of Elisha. And Elisha is a prophet, follows on from Elijah. So Elisha is a prophet. And the story is told in the Bible that he's losing his hair. So he's going bald. And he's walking past the forest one day, and two children begin to taunt him because of his bald head. Baldy, baldy. That's what they're doing. They're hassling him. And so Elisha calls to the forest, and out comes a female bear and it eats the children. Okay, biblical story. So it's there. And look, I agree. I'm in two minds about this, all right? Because there's a part where I say, I think one of the really rich aspects of scripture is that it is very warts and all, particularly the Old Testament. The Old Testament tells stories of people who are held up as heroes, but also they're kind of awful. King David, murderer, sex abuser. I would say sex abuser, worse than adultery. Bathsheba was not a willing participant in what happened, okay? So he's a sex abuser. But actually, he's still held there in scripture, and because one of the strengths of the Jewish community is they said, yes, this person is deeply flawed, and yet is also significant, and we kind of want to hold it all together. Now, yeah, and that's one of the things that I think we as a society are not very good at doing. I don't think we're very good at saying people have capacity to be good and bad. You get cast as one or the other for the most part, and yet we're all complicated and we have everything. Now, that's not to excuse them. It's not to say there shouldn't be justice if people do things wrong. I'm not saying that at all. But scripture is this demonstration of, let's not just tell the good parts of story, because as I say, I think that's what we do in our modern world, particularly with celebrity. We only want to tell the good stuff about them and we'll ignore the bad things. Okay. Anyway, I don't want to get too distracted by that stuff, but I think there is a strength to scripture that it does that. Yet at the same time, I don't know what I would say about this story easily in a 15-minute sermon on a Sunday morning. This is a tricky one, okay? So this passage, we don't mind that this one's actually not part of the preaching of the church, because it's not a good text to preach on. There are all sorts of other things. As I say, men having tent pegs put through their head in the middle of the night, these sorts of things, which again, quite gnarly stories, not for every day, in the same way that I don't take, churches are a place where there are children in context. I don't take my children to go and see the latest horror movie where people are hacked to pieces, or scary, terrifying things. I don't need to do that in church either. But there do need to be spaces where we also are educating around the broadness of scripture, and the fact that, because as I say, I think the risk is if we go too far that way, we end up sanitizing it, and the Bible starts becoming we end up with an unrealistic understanding of what the Bible is. We lose some of that richness and depth, because part of the role of scripture is it's stuff that we've got to wrestle with. It's there, it's in our texts, and our understandings of these things change. Like, as I say, David's a really complicated figure. How do we make sense of that? We want to say he's sort of a great leader, and then there's all this kind of horrible baggage. How do we deal with that? Well, those are good questions to be asking, not just about David, but about how we treat people in our world today. Just in this last week in Auckland, a person I'd met on several occasions, famous art supporter, and is going to prison for taking advantage of young men, okay, using his power and ability. Great patron of the arts. So on one hand, you've got a whole bunch of people, great patron of the arts, spread his money around, created all sorts of things, wonderful. And then you've got a bunch of people saying, and we're victims of this person, and there's a need for justice in this space. Really hard to hold those things together. And it's very hard for us to say, kind of both of those things are true. In some contexts, he's been really good. In other contexts, he's been really, really bad. Really bad. So much so we need to put him in prison, okay, even though he's old. Those things are hard to hold together, but scripture is kind of challenging us to say, how do we talk about these people? I don't have big answers about it, but I'm just saying, I think the challenge is there, and I think it's something for us all to think more about. I know I need to think more about it. Okay, a few more thoughts. Good preaching engages our minds critically. What do you think?
The first two is like, we're gonna say if we do it on too much.
Yes. She's building up. So those of you at home, Grace is, sorry, you can correct me if I paraphrase incorrectly. I'm doing my best listening here. Grace is essentially suggesting that people in congregations do have questions of text and wanting deeper understanding, and therefore inviting them into that opportunity to think more deeply about what text may be saying for them or how to understand these better is something that people would want to hear. I'm definitely open to that point. I think that's true. I think, and in fact, I think in lots of congregations, those people are often underserved. I can't back this up, but one of my personal viewpoints is I do think this is a factor influencing church decline. I think there are people who want a really engaged thinking reality. They want to wrestle with scripture. They don't want to just hear and be told this is how it is. They want to engage with it. And question, did it happen this way or not? Those sorts of big questions. And when that's underserved, people eventually go, well, I can't really make sense of this. I'm not being encouraged to do that. I can't do it by myself. Maybe I won't do this anymore. I just think that's a reality. Well, I know it's a reality for some people. Now, that said, there are also people in congregations who, I'm here to feel comfortable. I know what I know, and I don't want to be told any differently. Yeah. And there are particular congregations that are really good at that and are really good at making that known of, well, you said something today that made me uncomfortable and you're not doing it properly. I don't want to hear that sermon. Thank you. That's not how we do it here. And that definitely happens. And I know it happens because I've had so many students who have sat here in this class who have gone, Richard, we can't do anything that radical because our congregation will say, no, thanks. That's not how we were taught to do it. That's what you're saying is not right. Okay, so there is the other side of the coin. And again, how, knowing that there is that diversity feature, how do you meet the needs of people at either end of that spectrum and the people all in between? It's a hard thing to do, and it's why you've got to do different things on different occasions to meet those different needs. You can't just do critical thinking every week where you're really wrestling with it. It helps a lot, yeah. But building trust is the thing that will, and again, often the way that I will tackle that in preaching is, again, if I'm concerned that that's the dynamic, if I'm concerned, I've got some people who want to think critically, who want something new, a fresh idea, fresh perspective. Got a bunch of people who are going, I've been coming to this church, Richard, since I was a week old. I'm now in my 90s. Don't destroy my belief system. Okay. And that, look, I've had that in congregation, more than one congregation, that there is both. And when I typically earlier in those relationships, I will be more tentative and say, right, so you've heard this reading before. You've heard how it's talked about this way. That's all great stuff. I'm really on board with that, even if I'm not, I might say. I understand that stuff because I do understand that stuff. And I've been there and I've lived it and I believe it. And there's part of me that's also going, but I also need to explore some new ideas because I'm one of those people who likes new ideas. I like getting it. Like the one thing that I really look for when I hear another person preaching is I want that person, and it's a very low threshold, which not a lot of people meet. My one thing that I'm looking for is I want to hear one idea that I'm going to go away and go, I have not thought about it that way before. If I get that from a sermon, I'm happy. If I walk out of church and I go, I'm still thinking about that, then my needs have been met, because that's all I need. And it's amazing how few sermons actually get that. There are some that do, but there are a lot where I just go, heard it before. Oh, I've heard that before. Yes, I've heard that before. Oh, Jesus is the good shepherd. You don't say. Okay, I've heard it. All right. So, and like, partly that's me. I'm in my mid 40s, and just that was for grace. I'm in my mid 40s, and I started going to church when I was 5 days old. I have not missed many weeks in that period of time. I've heard a lot of sermons. So I have heard it before, and I'm not saying that to put people down. I've heard a lot of sermons. I've heard a lot of the ways to sing. But as I say, the way I tend to do it is I've heard that stuff before. Here it is. I can share it with you again. I know that stuff really well too. I do read something that was quite interesting over here. I thought that was quite interesting. Gave me a fresh perspective. You might like the fresh perspective. It's okay, that stuff's still there. That's not going away. This thing is not undermining that. This idea doesn't destroy this. If you need this and this is what you want, it's still there. I've still given it to you. And for those of you who need something else, there's this idea too. So it's meeting different needs. And it's a really hard thing to do. You can't do it every time, but sometimes, and look, by the time, look, as I said to you, I was vicar of parish, I was there for 10 years. By the time I was in year 10, I wasn't needing to do that anymore. I was able to just go, look, here it is. Okay, here's the new idea today. Let's forget about it. We don't need to do that old stuff anymore. We've done it. Hey, you know, and you also know that if you don't like it and you don't agree, it's okay, because you're allowed to. You don't have to agree. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to just go, let's entertain this idea. If it's for you, it is. And if it isn't, it isn't. And we're all okay. But that took a long time to get to that,
Yeah,
that
I
point.
think just to add to that, it's because you respect, you've shown enough respect to the leaders, that you do everything. I think that's what we find is true. The people in the city that feel like that they're going through it, and that person standing in that acknowledgement, it's a whole different attitude.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
still
yeah.
It's not even, like, I can't just say it like, you know, speak to me.
Yeah,
But I really want to share this. Let's do this together. And you can really come together and actually it drops different things.
yeah, yeah.
It really does. That's what we
Yeah,
do.
and there are other ways this is expressed too. I mean, look, one of the other ways it was expressed for me in my ministry of that valuing what has gone before is, in my tradition as an Anglican, we have what we would call our newer services. What are they now? 1989. So how many years? 30 what years old? The new services. So they're quite old, older than Grace. The new services were around before she was. There you go. Anyway, so then we have the new service, but then we have the really old services. Okay, and so we have one prayer book, which is the 1928 prayer book, and then we have the 1989 prayer book, the new prayer book. Okay, and there are some churches, and in the church, like once a month, I did a service using the old one, the 1928 prayer book. I don't like that prayer book. I don't like its theology. I don't like the way the prayers are done. There's a whole lot of stuff around how it's structured that just don't sit comfortably for me. But as a minister, I did it once a month because there are a bunch of people who that's what they grew up with. It's what they knew for the vast majority of their life. So they had that time from when they were around in 1928 right up until 1989, where that was the only thing they did. And so, yeah, again, it's that thing of recognizing that I can honor that tradition. I'm not fully signed up to it, but I'm signed up to them. And I'm honoring their tradition and their experience and their expectations. So I can do that, but then I can also do the new things too. So it's a kind of both end approach, I think. Couple more thoughts. Right. Good preaching does not pretend to know all the answers. Like, yeah, humility is a good point. I mean, I think definitely I'm implying something pretty clear here, but I put this one up because it's a bit of a warning. Because I think particularly, as I say, I was in my 20s when my preaching life started, when I was actively preaching. And I felt a certain pressure to be kind of the religious expert and to go, right, I've got degrees and qualifications and I know some stuff, and maybe that's my job as someone who preaches, is to sort of say, this is how it is, to give other people a degree of certainty. I was wrong about that, but I did feel that pressure. And it was pressure I put on myself. And I think it's a trap that a lot of people early in their preaching career get into, of people want certainty and I'm going to give it to them. Even if I'm uncertain myself, I'm still going to present it as if I know something. And there are lots of reasons we do that. Partly it's about that thing of appearing to be an expert. If we speak with confidence, if we speak with certainty, then people will go, oh, they're really good. They're doing this quite well. They really know their stuff, don't they? But again, that's about me and my ego and how I want to be perceived. It's not about doing the job of preaching, which is to serve a community. It's not to be celebrated by a community, all right? My job is to serve. So I do think there's a trap there around going, and it's very easy to fall, as I say, I think it's a really easy trap to fall into, but and sometimes we just need to be a little bit more careful around just how we craft our language. And it's that thing of anything we say, it's not saying this is the way, it's saying this is what I'm talking about today. I'm going to talk about it in this way today, which is not to say it's the way, it's a way. I just think it's an important distinction. Good preaching is born of real experience. It's quite an unreal experience. Most of us don't jump off a cliff, is what the image is trying to say here. Although most of us could imagine what that might be. So what do you think? Real experience, unreal experience? Yeah. Yeah. Does it have to be? Okay, so there are 4 pillars. Yeah, 4 pillars, and one of them is experience. But if you're preaching and you're preaching, talking about an experience, does it have to be your experience? Both? Okay, so one person said, so sorry for people, we've had one person in class who said, it probably helps if it's your experience. And another person said, well, it could be either. Maybe it's someone else's experience, maybe it's mine. Yeah.
You know, we'll give you a reason why. Because obviously now.
Yeah.
So this is what we talk about, and that's why
Yeah.
see, they start to judge because you don't know. You have no experience. And this is really what I teach you. So I stood up and you know, people with electric because they know already. Actually, she knows it. This is what we mean about.
Yeah. Yeah, so no, I get that example. So yeah, you're right. There are some places I wouldn't go. There are some places I wouldn't go. So for me, as a Pākehā male, priest, educated, there are some places I just shouldn't go. I'm not going to talk about the experience of, you know, a Tongan single mother. That's not my place to talk about what that experience is like. I can have empathy, I can understand, but it's not my place to tell that story. So I do think there are limits on it. Look, and I've been in context with people, as I say, no, I will just own this. White men are very good at thinking they can speak for everybody. I can own that, and because I'm talking about my people. But white men do have a terrible history of thinking that their experience is universal. And what we've learned, I'm pleased to say, in recent decades, is that this is not, well, recent years really, is that that's far from the case. That there are all sorts of different perspectives because they're born of different experience. Yeah, where that came quite tightly into focus for me was when Moana came out. And not long after the film Moana came out, and there was, in the literature, there was quite, but academics do not love Disney. Okay. Disney have a habit of, no, well, the criticism of Disney is that they find something that belongs to another culture and then they kind of commercialize it and they stamp it and then it becomes something for everyone to consume. So a people's history might suddenly become something that Disney now sells and makes money from. And there were those who said that that's kind of what happened with Moana. They took Pacific Island narratives and there was a certain amount of interaction with that, but then it's become this movie and this franchise, and now you have, you know, my Palangi daughters who own Moana dolls, and you know, this sort of thing. And like, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, my perspective on that shifted when I was teaching in Tonga, not long after this film came out, and I was there teaching English to a group of Tongan students at St Andrews School in Tongatapu, because I've used to go and do that quite often. Anyway, I was there and I was teaching English and I was talking to these students about how to break a story up into different parts and make it more interesting, and how you know, different forms of storytelling. And I was finding it quite hard going. And finally, I was hitting my head against the wall and I sort of said, look, what's a story you all really like? They went, what's a movie that you guys think is great? They went, Moana. All of them, all of these Tongan students were like, Moana. Why do you like it? Because it's our story. And so I went, okay, let's talk about it. And suddenly all of my English teaching, I could hang on that story. We could talk about all the different parts of the movie, how they decided to put this part of the story there and why didn't they put it there. And we were able to do a whole lot of exercise with that. Because these Tongan students went, this is us. This is us. We see that film. We don't, Disney schmizney. No, this is our story. They owned it. They thought it was theirs. And that experience changed my perspective. And because I'd read a lot of literature around representation in film, the idea of representation in film is that if I'm Polynesian, I should be able to watch TV movies and see people who look like me and go, oh yes, those people are like me. And this was the moment where I suddenly realized, oh, okay, this was about my privilege. Because I grew up in a world where everything I watched had people like me in it. And actually lots of people I know haven't had. So something like Moana is actually important and good, because there are people who have never seen themselves in film before who now see themselves in it. And it makes them value themselves more. So I think there's something incredibly positive about that. But again, yeah, getting a little bit off topic, but that's about real experience. And for me, that's just one of the places where I've learned that, like, I can tell my stories, but I need to be respectful of others. It's not my place to come and tell that story. So again, I don't think it was really the place of Disney to tell that story, but at the same time, quite a lot of care was taken. So, you know, Maori and Pacific Island people were involved in the creation of that narrative, and were drawn into the experience. So it wasn't just a bunch of white people coming in and saying, cool, this is a great story, we're going to take it and turn it into something else. That isn't actually what happened, because they essentially said, this isn't our story to tell. We do love the story though, and we want to help tell it for others. So, you know, that's progress. I think something might not be perfect, but it's better than it was. You know. Good thoughts. We'll come back to that stuff. Good preaching is entertaining. Yeah, look, it does. It does. It really varies. I mean, just a quick story. I mean, I did have a guest preacher who I invited to come and preach, and this was because another friend of mine said, no, you've got to get this person in. Like, great, it's a 10 out of 10 sermon. He's given it a bunch of times. It's really brilliant. Definitely get him along. It'll be great. And this person came in and they're giving their sermon and he's doing all sorts of things. He's picking up his guitar and singing songs halfway through. He's pulling out a machete and chopping up pieces of wood. There's a whole bunch of stuff coming in there. And I was sitting there in church as this was happening going, crumbs, that friend of mine who said this was a 10 out of 10 sermon has very different expectations of preaching than I do. Because like, yeah, there's a lot of showmanship happening here, but I'm not really bought into it. And I walked out from, anyway, the service finished. And after the service, there was an older gentleman who was 88 years old at the time. And he just came and he patted me on the shoulder and he said, "Well, Richard, that was very entertaining, wasn't it?" I went, "It sure was." And he said, "Just back to the regular next week, I think." And it sort of said it all. I mean, he sort of said, yeah, it was lots of performative stuff, but not a lot of substance. And this was a community that liked substance. So again, it's to what ends, but also, you're right, there's a context. Sometimes I know when I was as I say, I've already said, been an Anglican since I was a week old, less than a week old. And that's true, but there was also a time in my sort of mid-teens where I got involved in various youth revival movements and then became an intentional Christian in a very different way. It was of a more kind of Pentecostal evangelical form of Christianity was kind of what I got drawn into. And entertainment was one of the things that I was looking for because I was 15 and heck, I want to go to church when it feels like a rock concert because I like rock concerts. And it did keep me engaged. It didn't keep me engaged for a long period of time, but it was good for a stretch. For me, that stretch wasn't very long. It was about a year where I was into that form of Christianity and then heard a bunch of sermons that were really terrible. I went back to my Anglican church to go, hang on, I can't make sense of this. And my old minister went, "Oh, it's okay. We can talk about it some more." I went, "That's great," because I was told I wasn't allowed to talk about it at the church that I was just at last week. So anyway, that's my experience. So, but I do think like, I'm trying to be generous about that stuff. Like that's part of the experience I moved through. You know, a time and a place. For me, the answer is sometimes, maybe not often, but some of it here and there is not a bad thing, because again, it's part of the role. So. Okay, last couple of things we'll try and finish up soon. Good preaching engages the emotions. We've already talked about this a little bit. So we've already had a talk about engaging the emotions. Maybe not this particular emotion, although I have some experience of that. I have heard some very shouty sermons in Tonga. I have heard some. I have been in Samoan congregations as well, which have also been very shouty on occasion. I mean, interestingly, we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about the Methodist history of preaching, but some of the, particularly in the Tongan context, in Tongan Methodist churches, the thing about volume is actually a bit of a hangover from the way the Wesleyans were doing it centuries before. But we'll talk about that when we, because that's about half my lecture in that, but there is actually quite a strong connection there around shouting as part of it. So there's a tradition there. Anyway, we've talked a bit about this one. We'll jump. Is the role of the preacher to tell people what to believe? I think we've possibly covered this one off with an earlier topic. Again, it's a bit like being Mr. Know-it-all or Mrs. Know-it-all or Ms. Know-it-all, or just generally a know-it-all. Again, I think sometimes like there is a degree where we're educating people about aspects of the faith. So education, but education like in the same way that when I'm here in class, I can give you all a bunch of advice based on my experience. Okay, I'm talking here about my experience in this class. It's preaching class. I'm an experienced preacher. I'm also someone who's read and learned a lot about preaching. I'm trying to give that information to you. At the end of the day, what you go and do with that information is in your hands. It's not actually up to me, and I can't actually enforce that. It's ultimately over to you. And it's the same in our congregations too. And interestingly, the thing that I've learned, which is terrifying, is that I can say something which I think is very clear, which I feel quite passionate about, and I can have people walk out from having heard me with the exact opposite meaning to what I intended, and they will think that that was brilliant because that's what they needed to hear. Okay, so that happens too. That you come see, I'm hitting some marks. Like yeah. I mean, I think it comes. I think yeah. So sorry, it's been said in class. Is it not the purpose of preaching? Purpose of preaching to tell people what to believe? Well, my understanding of church, like this is okay. So what I believe church to be today. Okay, I believe that churches are gatherings of people who are all seeking God, and that we are all on that journey together. That we're there to provide support and encouragement for each of us on our journeys, even though we're probably in very different places on that journey. And part of my role as preacher is to do that, is to provide some encouragement. Oh, there's a great big highway over there that you might want to go and journey on. That's good for a while, okay? But that's not necessarily being directive of saying this is the only way you can travel. So I've been in churches where it's definitely been a case of this is how it's done. I can remember a sermon I heard as a teenager of, here are the 5 things you need to do to be a Christian. Number 1, and it was that clear. It was like, here's the checklist. And so I was like, okay, great, I'll do those 5 things. Except, number 5 was, anyway, I won't get into all the problems I had with it, but it was that approach. And that was fine for a few months. I did those things, but then I sort of like, that's the one. It feels quite prejudiced. It feels like I'm not being very nice to people if I do that one. And then that led me to sort of question the other ones, So whereas, and that's, as I say, it's partly why I ended up back in the Anglican Church, was because the Anglican approach in the congregation that I went back to was very much of, Richard, you're exploring, you're discovering these things and so on, but that's only one way. There are other ways of doing it. So for me, the idea of journeying together and sharing, and so for me, the idea, and when I'm trying to preach, it's trying to go, here are a whole bunch of different ways of going about it. And there are some sermons where I will be quite clear about that of, we're talking about the crucifixion, there are different ways of interpreting this, and actually all of them are part of our tradition. In our churches, we're quite good at talking about this one. You've probably heard that one quite a lot. It's summed up in the words, Jesus died for my sins. Lots of us know that theology really well. It's quite well entrenched in us. But actually, there are other ways of talking about it. Let's maybe talk about those a little bit. So now, all those people who go, but that works for me, Jesus died for my, that's great. Keep doing it. That works for you, that's fine. But actually, there are some of us who need to be Christians different to that. And we're stronger when we make room for those people, I think. So for me, I believe it's about exploring. And that's much more the way I do it. It's not what I used to do. Yeah. I mean, I came out with a theology degree and I was like, boy, have I got some strong opinions about the Trinity. I know where all the heresies are. I'm going to tell people how to be doing this properly. And my first couple of sermons on the Trinity were very much like that. And I think weren't very good as a result. And then I again just sort of relaxed a little bit and went, well, I can talk about this in a more fun and creative way. And it became better because it became more generous. Yeah. 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 You can really you can still much more loving than yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, and I get it. I do get it. For me, and it's I want to be careful with the language I use here because it can imply a judgment, and I don't mean it as a judgment, but I know that as I've grown in my faith, that need to be certain about things has become less. So I'm less certain, but I'm more faithful. Okay. And that sounds counterintuitive, but there was a time where I needed to go, I've got it nailed down. This is exactly the things that I should believe. I've got it sorted out. And actually, no, I don't need to be that. Well, some of those things became a prison for myself, actually. They were just bars of my own making. And that, again, that's what I was talking about earlier. God keeps getting bigger. Going, well, that served me in that time, and that was helpful then. But actually, God's bigger. God keeps getting bigger. Anyway, great preachers are great storytellers. I've already possibly shown my hand on this one. I have an opinion. Great preachers are great storytellers. Definitely are. So my great preaching teacher who taught at this college was a man named Honi Ka. And he was a tremendous preacher. He was incredibly gifted, and he was my preaching teacher. And when I did study preaching with him, he said, I have one thing to teach you. It is that great preachers are great storytellers. And if you're going to be a great teacher, you need to learn to tell stories, you need to gather stories, and you need to be able to tell them all, because it's all about story. And I agree with him, and I still do. 20 years on, if there's one thing that I'm going to go for in any sermon context, it will be, can I find a story that fits the purposes of this sermon? And I will use it. It's the one thing I use for every single sermon. And we will talk about this in detail later on, because I think it's a really important point, but it's one I'm going to hit week after week after week. If you want to do well, tell a story, find the story that you can tell. And again, there's quite a broad range of what telling a story means. The story might be the gospel story that you're telling on a particular Sunday. It might be an explanation. It might be this is where this idea came from. Or it might be this happened in this way on a particular, like, it might be a children's story, okay? There are all sorts of forms of story, but actually this is how humans share knowledge throughout time. For those of particularly, look, all of our cultures at some point had a point of oral storytelling, meaning before things were written down of telling, and some of us, that history is not as in the distant past, like as it is for some of us. Some of us, that's a long way back, but we come from cultures where writing happened earlier. Some of us, that oral storytelling is still very much alive. But actually, I think across most of humanity, telling stories is how we engage in anything. Who's watched television in the last week? So what sort of things have you watched? Documentary? No, what do documentaries do? Any stories there? Right? Yeah. 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 Okay. So snakes, it's about snakes, but ultimately there's going to be a story in there, right? Because if it's a documentary, it's going to be about history and engagement and where they've come from, these sorts of things. Yeah. Look, because actually almost every form of media that we instate, whether it's the news tells a story. It might be a 2-minute story of, there were 26 ram raids in Auckland this week. That's a story. Okay, that is a story. A documentary is a story, but Game of Thrones is a story. It's a fantasy story. It's made up, but it's a story. Okay. Star Wars is a story. All right. So everything's a story. Most books we read, even if it's an autobiography, it's a person saying, here's my story. Okay. This is how we share wisdom and knowledge and experience. So why would we leave that out of our preaching? It is the most natural thing that humans do, is we tell stories. Look, how was class tonight? Oh, I don't know. We had this random Palangi who told a bunch of weird stories, but oh no, it might be. Okay, you're going to tell a story because that's how we share what happened. Okay. So there you go. I think it's in there. Okay. Only 2 of these to go. All right, good preaching uses props. There's a video clip.
The number one thing above all things I
Love
could
this
talk
guy using
about
the prop.
that has destroyed our testimony, that has robbed our home, you're looking at it right there. That's it, the television. And the dirty, rotten computer and all the filth that comes on that too. And you know that it is. You're looking at it right there. I mean, you're looking at it. If you want to know what happened to Monopoly, that's it. If you want to know what happened to family time, that's it. If you want to know what happened to husband and wife fellowship, that's it. If you want to know what happened to good readers in your home, you're looking at it right there. If you want to know what happened to picnics and what happened to checkers and what happened to Scrabble and what happened to these things, you're looking at it right there. That's it right there. Now, wait a minute. If you want to know why we have the blasphemy and the vulgarity and the permissiveness and the materialism and the worldliness and the carnality and all the dirty, rotten things, more than anything in the world, you're looking at it right there. Oh, Brother Brown. Oh, Brother Brown. I know you're right. I know you're right, but I don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, good night, my wife. I know it's ruining our home, the filthy internet. We don't have any firewalls on it, don't have any blocks on it. And I know, and besides that, Brother Brown, the television, I know it's ruining. It's putting an ungodly, worldly atmosphere in our home. But there's nothing I can do. It was nothing you can do unless you just go forward. But you just go forward. You say, preacher, what can I do? She'd throw a fit. No, she wouldn't. No. Your wife's not going to say a word if you'll just go forward. Yeah. If you just go forward, you say, well, what can I do? Well, some night when she's cooking supper and, man, everything's getting grilled in there and your children sitting around here like a bunch of catfish at the end of a drain pipe soaking up all of that filth, you just sneak yonder into the garage and you get you and you come back, and while your wife's cooking, you say, children, you may want to move back a little bit. And you take this thing. You say, I hate that thing. I hate that thing. I hate that thing. I hate that thing. Yeah, well, wait a minute.
It was, yeah, definitely a bit of a 1-point sermon there, I think. And I'm not trying to be unkind to this gentleman, just so you know. I searched up the script because I've been in a church where essentially this sermon was preached, and a person destroyed a television, took a sledgehammer to a television, all about the terrible things. And it's like, even at a fairly young and impressionable age, I was quite committed to my television, actually. I was like, I don't know, I watched quite a lot of stuff on television. So anyway, I wasn't on board right at that point in time. You know, again, I've seen in stand-up comedy, which is a good place to, like, we'll talk about stand-up comedy later on, because it's a place that where people literally get up and tell stories and jokes and would make people laugh. But like, what's often kind of considered the worst end of this is what's called prop comedy, which is where people literally pull weird things out and do strange things with them. Sometimes it's funny, but it also even in the world of comedy, it's looked at as being not the best kind of approach to comedy. So again, it's like, if I know that in the world of comedy where there's lots of really great comedy, that even those people who do it really well go, that's maybe not the best avenue to go. I'd say something similar in church. I've seen lots of sermons where people have brought out all sorts of things. You know, I've wheeled out a great big wheelie bin, and my big moment is we're going to get all of these bits of paper and we'll all put it in there, and that will be us, you know, saying goodbye to all of these temptations, you know, these sorts of things. And they're never really terribly effective. They do work with younger people better to make a simple point, but it's not something I'd really be working with adults for the most part, because again, people tend to remember the kind of stunt, you know, the performance, rather than the message. So it often gets in the way. That's just a caution. Look, I'd love it for one of you students just to go like, nah, going to get some props, and here we go. Go for it if you do. Prove me wrong. Convince me that's a good thing. Here we go. Last couple. A good sermon will offend some people. I wouldn't say will, but might. Jesus said some pretty hard-nosed things, to be honest. I won't get into a list of what I think the hard-nosed things were, but again, some aspects of the gospel are challenging and hard, particularly when it comes to things like wealth redistribution. You know, care for the poor, these sorts of messages. There are certain contexts where those things still don't hit people well, you know, because they're challenging. It causes us to question the choices we've made and how we deal with those things. So, and that's just at the low end of the spectrum, I think, in terms of simple things I can point to. But there is, yeah. And again, it's not going out deliberately to offend some people, but, you know, sometimes if you're doing it right, if someone takes exception to something you say, hopefully the relationship is strong enough that you can continue that conversation. I have had that happen. I have had that happen where I preached actually in a church where there had been, unfortunately, there had been a spate of youth suicides in the community I was in, and members of the National Front, which is a white supremacist group, had written a whole lot of really ugly stuff about it and discrimination based around this stuff, and done a whole lot of pamphlet drops in the area. And I took the opportunity to basically say, get up on a Sunday and say, so who got this in the mail? A whole bunch of people went, oh yeah, actually, that got dropped into my letterbox. And I said, okay, let's talk about where it comes from and what problems are here. Now, actually, the people behind this are white supremacists. They're trying to stir up race stuff in our community. None of these people even reside in this community. They've come from the Hutt Valley over to the coast to do this because they're trying to pick up on something that's happened in our community. And we talked about it. And at the end of that, a person stood up and said, I take real exception to this. Richard, I'm really offended that you brought this up in church. It's like, and this has been a really terrible thing. Now, at the end of this, now the thing is, that person was a teacher in one of the schools where one of these young people had taken their life. So I brought that up in church, and she was triggered. She went, you're taking me into this space, which is really hard in my profession. So what she objected to was not what I was saying, but the fact that she was being confronted with it in church. And she went, and she had an emotional outburst. Unfortunately, there was another clergy person who came and said, oh, look, it's all okay. We'll pray for that. We moved on with the service. And 3 weeks later, this person turned up to church having sewn a stole, a clerical vestment, and gave it to me as a gift to kind of apologize. So I had this, I'm feeling really bad, and I'm trying to make it right. And like, it was fine, because I basically said, no, it's okay, because that happened, and it didn't come at my expense at all. Like, it felt, I was a little bit like, whoa, okay, didn't see that coming. But it was a learning thing for me too. And again, the relationship was strong enough that, like, at the end of the day, she felt safe enough with me to do that. And actually it was okay, and it was fine. But is that thing of sometimes those things can happen, is that, and it was just a case of I touched a nerve with someone, and that was me being a little bit reckless, and I was younger, and I would possibly have done a little bit more homework around that prior to doing that. But you know, it was actually fine. So, last thought, a good preacher is charismatic. My answer, not necessarily, but it can help. It's really my feeling on this. There are definitely some people who are naturally charismatic, meaning that they sort of have a warmth and a radiance to them and stuff. But I also think, and that does help, you know, there are some people that you can think of who are public speakers and you just go, they've got it, I want to hear what they have to say. And there are definitely some people I go, oh yeah, okay, I get that. As I've already acknowledged, I'm about 3% as charismatic as I think as I'd like to be. That's my own scale there. But I think it's something that we can work at. And I think the real keys to charisma is actually about getting comfortable, believing in ourselves, and working at the craft. Because preaching is a craft. And the good thing about being a craftsperson is that you can get better at it by working at it. That actually most people, if you're going to get up there and you feel called to it, with practice, you will get better. I mean, I'm at a point in my life where there are some people who are like, yeah, we really appreciate your preaching, Richard. I've had a lot of time to do it. There have been a lot of duds along the way, for sure, but each one of those is an opportunity to learn and to go, oh, I'll do that differently. And again, put the time in each time. So even now, even almost 20 years into my ordained ministry, and I was preaching before I was ordained as well, is I will still rehearse it. I will still, every sermon that I write, I will still sit there and read through it multiple times and practice it and get comfortable so that I can do it as naturally as possible. It's something I will always do because it's just good practice to do that. Anyway, we're going to finish up. Homework, course book chapter 2, go and read chapter 1 as well. I will, for those of you who would just want to borrow a hard copy, I will make sure I have those here next week, so you can borrow if you're here in class. But other than that, we are done for this week. Thank you everyone for being attentive. I know classes can feel quite long at times, but I appreciate you hanging